If you have ever carried the weight of a lie told by the very people who were supposed to protect you, if you have ever stood in the ruins of your own reputation while those who betrayed you built empires on your silence, then this story is for you. Prepare to discover what happens when a 47-year-old woman, stripped of her home and her dignity by her own family, finds a hidden truth that has been waiting in the dark for 20 long years. Welcome to Silver Linings Tales. Subscribe now, because what Grace Montgomery does with this truth will remind you that justice doesn't care about the passage of time, and some secrets are born to explode. The October wind off Lake Michigan did not blow, it scraped. It carried the scent of damp earth, dying oak leaves, and the distinct metallic tang of coming winter. Grace Montgomery stood on the crushed limestone driveway of Oak Ridge Equestrian Manor, her hands buried deep in the pockets of a faded canvas coat. Inside her right pocket, her thumb rhythmically traced the jagged, cold ridges of a small brass key. It was the only thing she owned that didn't fit into a cardboard box. A few yards away, a battered yellow donation truck sat idling, its exhaust pipe puffing gray plumes into the crisp autumn air. Two men in dirty work shirts were tossing boxes into the back with the careless efficiency of people handling garbage. They weren't moving her things, they were clearing them out. There would be no storage unit, no transition period. To her family, Grace was already a ghost, and ghosts did not require closet space. "The truck needs to be gone by 11, Grace," a voice cut through the drone of the engine. Victor Montgomery did not look at his sister. He stood near his silver Lexus, the polished metal of the car reflecting the dull, white sky of suburban Chicago. He was 48, just a year older than Grace, but his hands were soft, untouched by the manual labor of the stables. He adjusted the cuffs of his camel hair coat, his gold signet ring catching the weak morning light. "The surveyors from the European Consortium are arriving at noon," Victor added, tapping a leather-bound planner against his thigh. "We can't have clutter on the driveway." Clutter? Grace looked at the box currently being hoisted into the truck. Through the open flap, she could see the corner of a green wool blanket, the one she had used to keep the newborn foals warm during the freezing Illinois winters. "I built those stalls, Victor," Grace said. Her voice was quiet, lacking the high-pitched panic of a victim. It was the flat, steady tone of a woman who had spent 20 years speaking only to horses. "I kept this place alive when Father died." Victor finally turned his head, his eyes hooded. He checked his steel wristwatch. "The partnership agreement from 1980 is quite clear, Grace. You forfeited your claim to the estate's capital. Father's will reflected that. You've been living here on charity. Now the charity is over." Grace did not flinch. Instead, her gaze shifted to the young woman standing slightly behind Victor. Ashley was 22, her long blonde hair pulled back into a flawless, tight ponytail. She wore tailored riding breeches and custom-made leather boots that had never known the muck of an unclean stall. She was holding a leather crop, flexing it slightly between her gloved hands, her eyes fixed firmly on the gravel. "Ashley," Grace said. The girl shifted her weight. Her boots creaked in the silence. She did not raise her head. "Mom, please, don't make a scene. Uncle Victor is paying for my training in West Palm Beach. If we don't close this deal with the consortium, I lose my spot on the Olympic selection team. You have to be realistic." "Realistic," Grace repeated. The word tasted like dust. "Is that what we call it now?" "We told you weeks ago to look at the townhouses in Elgin," Ashley muttered, her voice dropping to a defensive whisper. You refused to do anything. You sat in the workshop like if you ignored it, the world would stop." "I was working," Grace said simply. She pulled her hands out of her pockets. Her knuckles were red from the cold, the skin calloused from decades of stitching heavy leather harnesses. "I was finishing the custom saddle you used to win the regional trials last month, the one your uncle claimed he bought for you." Ashley's head snapped up, a flush of pink rising on her cheeks. But Victor stepped smoothly between them, his large frame blocking Grace from her daughter's view. "That's enough, Grace," Victor said. The polished charm was gone, replaced by the hard, unyielding authority he used in boardrooms. "You made your bed in 1980. You chose a certain path, and actions have legal definitions. The family has carried your reputation for 20 years. We're done." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, sleek mobile phone, a symbol of the new millennium's wealth, and walked toward the main house without looking back. Ashley stood still for a second, the leather crop trembling slightly in her hand. I'll call you, Mom, once we get settled in Florida." "No, you won't," Grace said. She didn't say it with anger. It was a statement of fact, as cold and clean as the wind. Ashley turned and followed her uncle, her boots clicking against the stones, until the heavy oak door of the manor house clicked shut behind her. Grace stood alone on the driveway. The donation truck slammed its back doors shut, the metal latch echoing across the empty paddocks like a gunshot. The driver gave a short, apologetic nod through the window and drove away, leaving a swirl of dead leaves in his wake. Grace looked down at her hand. She opened her palm. The brass key lay there, tarnished and dull, but solid. It was the key to the Old North stable, the original unheated barn at the very edge of the property, built before the family became rich, before the lies became their foundation. "Let's see what you left me, Mother," Grace whispered. Holding her single duffel bag of leather working tools, she turned her back on the white-painted mansion and walked toward the shadows of the old barn. A legal document has a specific physical weight. It is heavier than ordinary paper, stiffer, bound in a thick blue paper backing that is designed to feel like a guillotine. Victor reached into the passenger seat of his Lexus and pulled out a heavy manila envelope. He did not hand it to Grace. He laid it on the hood of his car, letting the wind catch the edge of the flap. "This is the formal detainer," Victor said. He adjusted his sunglasses, the dark lenses hiding his eyes, turning his face into a mask of polished steel. "Signed by Judge Vance yesterday afternoon. It gives you until noon to vacate the main residential zones and the active training arenas. Officially." Grace looked at the envelope. Her name was printed in cold block letters. Across the front. Grace M. Montgomery. "Judge Vance," Grace said. Her voice was flat, dry. "The same Vance who drapes his legs over your terrace every July 4th? Victor straightened his wool coat, smoothing a non-existent crease near the pocket. "The law is indifferent to who pours the drinks, Grace. The estate was left entirely to me. Father's instructions were legally binding. You had a life estate in the cottage, yes, but only under the condition that the property remained in the family name. The sale to the European Consortium voids that clause." Ashley took a step forward. Her leather riding gloves made a dry, sliding sound as she clenched her fists. "It's not just about the sale, Mom. You know that." Grace looked at her daughter. The wind whipped a loose strand of blonde hair across Ashley's face. The wind whipped a loose strand of blonde hair across Ashley's face. But the girl did not brush it away. Her jaw was set, tight and defensive. "Go on, Ashley," Grace said. "Say the rest." "The sponsor," Ashley said, her voice dropping, though it didn't lose its edge. "The representative from the Zurich group. They did a background check on the family trust. They asked Uncle Victor about the incident from 1980. They wanted to know why one of the primary founders of Oak Ridge was listed in the county sheriff's archives for grand larceny." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the distant hum of the highway and the dry rattle of dead cornfields across the road. "Larceny," Grace murmured. "We had to explain it, Mom," Ashley said, her voice rising slightly, defensive and thin. "Do you have any idea how that feels? I'm trying to secure a 6-figure sponsorship, and the board is asking why my mother stole $80,000 from her own father's safe. It's embarrassing. It's been dragging us down for 20 years. Grace did not defend herself. She did not raise her voice, nor did she point out that the luxury SUV Ashley had driven to the stables was paid for by the very estate she was being kicked off of. She simply watched her daughter's knuckles. Turn white against the crop. "You believe I took it," Grace said. Ashley looked away, her gaze landing on the gleaming hood of Victor's car. "The police found the key in your room, Mom, and the train ticket to San Francisco. Father didn't just make it up. People don't just invent things like that." "Your mother has always had a difficult relationship with reality, Ashley," Victor said, his tone conversational, almost pleasant. He picked up the manila envelope and tapped it against the car's roof. She preferred the company of horses to people who could hold her accountable. But the county records don't lie. The family chose not to prosecute back then to spare us the public trial, but the truth remains on paper. He tossed the envelope. It landed on the gravel near Grace's worn leather boots. "Take it," Victor said. "Or don't. The sheriff's deputy will be here at 12:15 to escort you off the residential perimeter. If you're still near the house, it will be treated as civil trespass. I've already had the locks on the cottage changed." Grace looked down at the blue-back document resting on the gray stones. A speck of mud had already splattered across her name. "The locks," she said. "This morning," Victor replied, checking his watch again. "Your personal clothing and the rest of your tools have been placed in the donation bin. We kept the leatherworking bench. It belongs to the property's inventory. You can leave now. There's nothing left for you here." Grace did not reach for the envelope. She stood straight, her chin slightly lifted, the old canvas coat offering little protection against the mounting chill. Her silence was a physical wall between them, heavy and absolute. Ashley shifted her feet, her eyes darting from her mother to the manor house. "We're not being cruel, Mom. We're moving forward. You should have planned for this. You've had 20 years to find your own place." "We're done here, Ashley," Victor said, catching the girl by the elbow. "Let's go inside. The lawyers are calling from Chicago." He guided the girl toward the stone steps of the mansion. Ashley did not look back. She walked with her head down, her boots striking the stone with a rhythmic, hollow sound. Grace waited until the heavy oak door shut, the brass latch clicking into place with a definitive metallic finality. Slowly, she bent down. Her joints popped in the cold air. She picked up the damp envelope, shook the gravel from its edges, and tucked it under her arm. She turned her face toward the dilapidated gray silhouette of the Old North stable. Her boots sank into the wet gravel as she began the long walk down the path, her single duffel bag banging against her thigh with every step. The Old North stable had been built to outlast the family. While the modern riding arenas were made of prefabricated steel, this barn was hand-hewn oak. Grace gripped the heavy iron handle of the sliding door. It fought her, rusted rollers grinding against the overhead track with a screech that seemed to startle the crows in the nearby pine trees. She threw her shoulder into the wood, shifting her weight until the door groaned open 18 inches, just enough for her to squeeze through with her duffel bag. Inside, the air was stagnant, colder than the wind outside. Gray shafts of midday light pierced the gaps in the high wooden rafters, illuminating thick columns of floating dust. The smell was a heavy, comforting sediment: dry hay, old horse liniment, linseed oil, and 20 years of absolute silence. Grace dropped her duffel bag onto a dusty wooden grain bin. The dull thud echoed through the empty stalls. She sat down on the edge of the bin, her knees stiff, and stared at her hands. "She's going to live in the dirt," Victor's voice echoed in her mind, a memory from their final argument in the main house the night before. He had stood by the fireplace, swirling 2 fingers of scotch in a crystal glass. "Let her go, Ashley. A week of freezing her fingers off in that ruin, and she'll realize she can't handle being a vagrant. She'll sign the release for the Elgin townhouse and be glad we're paying the deposit." Cold nights have a way of bringing stubborn people to their senses. Ashley had nodded then, her face tight with a mixture of embarrassment and relief. "She's just doing this to make us feel guilty, Uncle Victor. She's always been like this, dramatic." Grace let out a slow, quiet breath. Her chest felt tight, but there were no tears. She had run out of tears in 1980 when her father called her a thief. She stood up, her boots scraping on the dry dirt floor, and began to inspect her new sanctuary. At the back of the barn, partitioned off by a thick tongue-and-groove oak wall, was the old harness room. It had been her mother Miriam's private domain. Long before Oak Ridge became a commercial enterprise, Miriam had spent her afternoons here, oiling the leather tack, repairing lead ropes, and escaping her husband. Grace pushed the harness room door open. It did not creak. The brass hinges were still solid, green with oxidation, but aligned perfectly. The room was small, about 10 by 12 feet. A workbench made of thick pine planks ran along the far wall, covered in a gray shroud of cobwebs and dust. On the wall above, empty wooden pegs hung like crooked fingers where silver-trimmed bridles had once rested. In the corner stood a rusted pot-belly stove, its flue pipe venting through the stone wall. Grace walked over, lifted the cast-iron lid, and peered inside. It was empty, save for a few dried leaves and a mummified mouse. She reached into her duffel bag and pulled out a small, battery-operated lantern, one of the few practical items she had managed to save from her cottage. She clicked it on. The bright blue-white LED beam cut through the gloom, casting long, sharp shadows across the rough stone walls. This was where she would stay. She had no electricity. The water pump outside was connected to a deep well that still ran clean, though she would have to prime the iron handle with a bucket of water from the creek. She had a wool blanket, a small camping stove, and her tools. Most importantly, she had peace. For the first time in 23 years, no one was watching her. No one was waiting for her to fail. No one was looking at her with the quiet, lingering suspicion that she was a criminal waiting to strike again. She set the lantern on the workbench. The light caught the edge of her canvas coat, where the small brass key in her pocket pressed against her thigh. Her mother's dying words had stayed with her. Buried under 20 years of daily survival. Go to the Old North stable, Grace, under the floorboards of the harness room. I couldn't. I was too weak. But you are strong. You have always been the strong one. Grace looked down at the wide pine planks of the harness room floor. They were gray with age, some warped by the moisture of the earth beneath, but they were silent. Grace looked down at the wide pine planks of the harness room floor. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the brass key, letting it catch the cold light of the LED lantern. Memory, in the dark, is a physical weight. Grace sat on an upturned wooden crate, wrapping her canvas coat tighter. The blue-white glow of the battery-operated lantern cast her shadow against the rough pine wall. But in her mind, the shadow was much larger. It was the broad, imposing silhouette of her father, Charles Montgomery. It had been an August night in 1980. The air had been thick, heavy with the promise of a summer thunderstorm that never quite broke. Grace had been 17, her mind filled with the simple, bright dreams of a girl who believed the world was as honest as the horses she trained. She had been in love. Jesse Thorne had been 18, a boy from the wrong side of the county line who worked the livery stables in town. He had grease under his fingernails and a laugh that made the suffocating atmosphere of Oak Ridge feel bearable. He had given her a silver-plated horseshoe charm on a cheap leather cord. She had hidden it under her pillow like a treasure. But Charles had other plans. Charles had kept $80,000 in cash and bearer bonds in the heavy green safe in his study. It was the culmination of 3 years of breeding profits, earmarked to buy Sovereign, a champion thoroughbred stallion from a Kentucky syndicate. Victor, 18 and already mimicking the expensive habits of the Chicago elite, had spent his summer running up debts with men who did not take excuses. The storm that night did not come from the sky. It came through Grace's bedroom door. The heavy oak panel slammed against the plaster wall with a crack that shook the window panes. Charles stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his face a dark, dangerous red. He did not speak. He walked straight to her bed, grabbed the edge of her mattress, and flipped it to the floor with a single, violent heave. Grace had scrambled backward into the corner, her knees pressed to her chest. "Father, what—" The safe key, the small silver key Charles kept on his personal ring, clinked as it hit the bare floorboards. It rolled, stopping against the toe of Charles's leather boot. Beside it lay $2,000 bearer bonds, their green borders gleaming in the dim lamplight. Charles reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a slip of yellow paper. He threw it at her. It was a one-way train ticket from Chicago to San Francisco, dated for that Friday. "I got a call tonight," Charles had rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "From the tavern in town. Jesse Thorne was bragging to the mechanics about how he was taking my daughter to California. Said he'd found a way to fund a new life." "I don't know what that is," Grace had whispered, her fingers clawing at the wooden floorboards. "I've never seen that ticket, Father. I swear to you." "The key was under your mattress, Grace," Charles said. "The bonds were with it. You stole from me. You stole the family's future for a grease monkey." He had dragged her down the stairs by her arm, ignoring her screams. Outside, Jesse was already waiting. Outside in the gravel driveway, Jesse was already waiting, held by two of Charles's senior grooms. He was bleeding from the corner of his mouth. Charles had reached behind the front door, pulled out his double-barreled shotgun, and walked onto the porch. "If I see you on this property again," Charles had said, "I will bury you under the manure pile. No one will look for you. No one will care." Jesse had looked at Grace, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute betrayal. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The grooms threw him onto the gravel, and he scrambled to his feet, running into the dark Illinois woods. Grace had dropped to her knees, her nightgown soaking up the cold mud of the driveway. Victor had stood on the porch, his hands tucked into his pockets, his face pale. Victor had stood on the porch, his hands tucked into his pockets, his face pale but entirely composed. He had looked down at her with a soft, practiced pity. "How could you do this to us, Grace?" Victor had muttered. "How could you ruin everything?" Behind the screen door, Miriam Montgomery had stood like a statue. Her fingers clutched the wire mesh, her eyes wide with a paralyzing fear of her husband. She had looked at her daughter kneeling in the mud, then at her golden son on the porch. She had closed eyes. She had turned around. She had walked back into the dark house, leaving her daughter to the mercy of the wind. Grace rubbed her temples, the memory fading as the cold air of the year 2000 harness room pressed back against her skin. She looked down at the brass key in her palm. 20 years, she whispered. The silence of the barn was her only answer. She stood up, gripped the handle of her battery-operated lantern, and looked at the gray pine floorboards beneath her feet. It was time to find out what her mother's silence had cost them both. The truth does not rot. It simply waits under the floorboards, breathing the damp, dark air of the earth. Grace knelt on the cold pine planks of the harness room floor. She placed the battery-operated lantern on the wood beside her, adjusting the swivel head so the stark white beam focused on the corner behind the rusted potbelly stove. She reached into her duffel bag and pulled out her heavy-duty leather awl, a thick steel tool with a sharp, flat head, designed for punching through triple-ply harness leather. Her mother Miriam had been precise, even in her terror. Behind the stove, Grace, where the salt lick used to hang, the 3 short planks. Grace tapped the steel butt of the awl against the floor. Thump. Solid oak. She moved 3 inches to the left. Thump. She moved behind the stove, where the wood was stained dark with decades of soot and coal dust. She tapped again. Thunk. The sound was hollow, dry, like an empty coffin. Grace felt a sudden, sharp spike in her chest. Her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slid the flat head of the awl into the seam between the planks. The wood was warped. The iron nails that had once held it down rusted to dust years ago. She leaned her weight onto the tool, using it as a lever. The old pine groaned, a dry, splintering shriek that seemed incredibly loud. She gripped the edge of the board with her bare hands, her fingers digging into the rough, splintered grain, and pulled. The plank gave way with a wet, tearing sound, releasing a thick, musty odor of damp earth, decaying wood, and old grease. Grace set the board aside and shone the lantern into the dark cavity beneath the floor. Between 2 thick oak joists, resting on a bed of dry gravel, was a package. Was a rectangular package wrapped in black, rotting oilcloth. It was covered in cobwebs, the fabric stiff and smelling faintly of kerosene and old wax. Grace reached into the hole. Her hand brushed against the cold stone foundation of the barn, her skin tingling at the chill. She wrapped her fingers around the bundle and lifted it out. She laid the bundle on the clean floorboards in front of the lantern. With careful, steady fingers, she began to peel back the layers of oilcloth. The fabric was so brittle, it crumbled in her hands like burnt paper, leaving black flakes on her palms. Underneath the wrapping was a heavy green steel cash box. It was a standard mid-century office box, its paint chipped, showing patches of red rust. On the front, a small brass padlock hung from the iron latch. Grace's hands were shaking now, so badly that she had to press her palms against her thighs to steady them. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass key. The metal felt warm from her body heat, a sharp contrast to the cold steel of the cash box. She fitted the key into the lock. It stuck at first, decades of dust fighting against her. Grace took a slow, deep breath, stabilizing her wrist with her left hand, and twisted. The lock remained stubborn. She pressed harder, her thumb slipping against the metal, leaving a tiny smear of dirt. She twisted again, putting the strength of her shoulder into the turn. Click. The sound was sharp, metallic, and clean. The brass padlock popped open, the shackle swinging free. She lifted the heavy lock away and set it on the floor. She took a breath, holding the cold air in her lungs, and lifted the lid of the cash box. Inside, resting on a bed of faded red felt, were 2 items. The first was a thick leather-bound book, the original corporate ledger of Oak Ridge Equestrian Manor from 1980, its cover stamped with the initials CM in faded gold foil. The second was a small gray plastic device, a Sony microcassette recorder, a common tool for businessmen and lawyers in the late 20th century. A tiny 60-minute cassette tape was already loaded inside, the black magnetic ribbon frozen on the plastic reels. Grace stared at the recorder, the white light of her lantern reflecting off the small plastic window. Her thumb hovered over the play button. Dead batteries do not carry the voice of the dead. Grace picked up the gray plastic microcassette recorder. The weight was minimal, the cheap plastic feeling fragile compared to the heavy steel of the cash box. She turned it over, her thumb sliding the battery compartment hatch open. A small shower of white, crusty powder fell onto her lap. The original copper-top batteries had leaked, their acid dry. Their alkaline acid dry and corroded, sealing the metal spring contacts in a chalky, greenish-white crust. Grace did not curse. She reached for her leather awl, using the flat steel tip to carefully scrape the corrosion off the gold-plated springs. She blew into the compartment, the white dust puffing into the cold air of the harness room. She opened her duffel bag, took out her LED lantern, and twisted the base. She slid out the 3 fresh AA batteries she had bought at the hardware store in town just 2 days ago. She fitted them into the microcassette recorder, the springs compressing with a stiff, clean click. She slid the hatch back into place. The lantern was dead now, but the pale blue moonlight filtering through the window was enough. Grace rested her thumb on the heavy plastic play button. She pressed down. The button engaged with a loud mechanical clack. For 3 seconds there was only the dry, rushing sound of magnetic tape sliding over the playback head. A low, rolling hiss of static filled the small room. Then a voice cut through the white noise. "Julian, stop pacing. Sit down." Grace's breath hitched. It was her mother. Miriam's voice was younger, sharper than Grace remembered from her final years, but the distinct, nervous tremor in her tone was unmistakable. A heavy sigh on the tape, the sound of a chair scraping against wood. Then a wet, ragged sob. "I can't, Mother. The police. They were at the country club today. They were asking about the bearer bonds. If Father finds out—" "He won't find out," Miriam's voice said. "He won't find out," Miriam's recorded voice interrupted, flat and cold. "Not about you." "He found the key in Grace's room," the younger Victor sobbed on the tape. His voice was thin, nasal, completely stripped of the corporate confidence he would wear like armor 20 years later. "I put it there. I put the bonds under her mattress, Mother. I had to. The men from Chicago said they'd burn the barns. The men from Chicago said they'd burn the barns with the horses inside if I didn't pay. They knew Father had the cash for the stallion." On the tape, Miriam did not scream. There was only a long, agonizing pause. "You let your sister take the blame, Victor," Miriam said, her voice dropping to a whisper that made the static hiss rise. "Your father threw her in the mud. He ruined her name. She was supposed to go to Northwestern in the fall. Now she is cleaning stalls like a tenant." "Grace is strong," Victor's recorded voice rose in a desperate, cracking shriek. "She can handle him, Mother. She's always been the favorite anyway. If Father finds out it was me, he'll write me out of the estate. He'll put me in the street. I swear to God, Mother, if you tell him, I'll hang myself. I'll hang myself from the rafters of the North Stable. I'll do it tonight." Grace stared at the spinning plastic reels of the cassette. Her vision blurred, the pale moonlight fracturing into sharp needles of light. On the tape, the younger Victor was weeping openly now, the sound pathetic and hollow. "Please, Mother, please, don't tell him." Another silence, so long that Grace thought the tape had run out. Then Miriam's voice returned. It was dead, devoid of hope. "I will keep your secret, Victor, to save your miserable life. But you will speak the truth into this recorder. You will say exactly what you did and how you did it. Because if you ever look at your sister again with anything but gratitude, if you ever try to push her out of this family, I will hand this tape to the sheriff myself." A rustle of clothing, a deep, trembling breath from the young man. "My name is Victor Montgomery," the voice on the tape whispered, raw and shaking. "I stole the $80,000 in cash and bearer bonds from my father's safe on August 12, 1980. I forged the train ticket to San Francisco and planted the safe key under my sister Grace's mattress to make it look like she did it. Grace had nothing to do with it." The tape ended with a sharp, magnetic click as the recorder stopped. The silence that returned to the harness room was absolute, heavier than the cold air, heavier than the shadows. Grace sat frozen, her thumb still resting on the plastic case of the recorder. A single hot tear slid down her weathered cheek, dripping onto the collar of her canvas coat. Her mother had known. For 20 years, Miriam had watched Grace live as an outcast, had watched her clean the stables of the manor while Victor drove expensive cars and dined with judges. Miriam had chosen her son's weakness over her daughter's innocence. She had bought Victor's survival with Grace's soul. Grace let out a slow, shuddering breath. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. The grief in her chest turning into something else. Something hard, sharp, and perfectly clear. She looked down at the gray plastic recorder. She did not have a home anymore. She had no daughter who loved her and no brother who respected her. But she had the truth, and it was a weapon. A needle does not feel guilt. It only mends what has been torn. Grace walked to the tall cedar wardrobe in the corner of the harness room. The wood was swollen from decades of humidity, the doors sticking until she pulled with enough force to make the old copper hinges scream. Inside, hanging on a rusted wire hanger, was her mother's vintage riding coat. It was a long, heavy duster made of premium dark brown calfskin, tailored in the late 1970s. Miriam had worn it to the National Equestrian Gala in 1978, the night Oak Ridge's lead stallion had won the Triple Crown. It was a garment of absolute authority, elegant, structured, with silver embossed buttons along the double-breasted front and a high, stiff collar. But 20 years of neglect had taken their toll. The leather was dry, parched, covered in a dull gray film of mildew. The silver buttons were black with tarnish, and the silk lining was torn at the armpits where moths had nested. Grace pulled the heavy coat from the wardrobe. She laid it flat across her mother's old pine workbench, right beside the LED lantern she had reassembled using the last of her spare batteries. She opened her duffel bag, her fingers finding her professional leather-working tools. She had spent 20 years repairing the saddles of people who looked down on her. She knew exactly how to make dead skin breathe again. First, she took a jar of amber-colored neatsfoot oil and a scrap of clean sheepskin. She poured the oil onto the leather, the rich, fatty scent of the grease immediately cutting through the musty smell of the barn. Slowly, methodically, she rubbed the oil. She rubbed the oil into the calfskin in tight, circular motions. The dry leather drank the oil greedily, the pale, gray-brown calfskin darkening, turning into a deep, glossy chocolate black. The suppleness returned to the hide, the stiff creases softening under her palms. Grace worked with a steady, rhythmic pressure, her shoulders aching, her fingers slick with grease. Next, she took her brass-bristled brush. She leaned over the coat, scrubbing the double row of silver buttons. With every stroke, the black tarnish flaked away, revealing the bright, sterling silver beneath, engraved with the original Oak Ridge crest, 2 crossed whips and a rising sun. Then she threaded her heavy glover's needle with black, 3-ply waxed linen thread. Punch, pull, tighten. She repaired the torn silk lining, her stitches so small and tight they were virtually invisible. She adjusted the shoulders, narrowing the seams to fit her own leaner, stronger frame. She took in the waist, transforming the boxy 1970s cut into a sharp military silhouette that would fall to the middle of her calves. By the time the first pale orange light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the stable wall, the work was finished. Grace stood up, her back popping, her fingers stiff and stained with oil and silver polish. She hung the coat from a wooden peg on the wall and stepped back. In the weak morning light, the coat did not look old. It looked timeless. It looked like armor. She reached into her duffel bag and pulled out a small, cracked hand mirror she had kept from her old vanity. She hung it on a rusty nail above the workbench and looked at her reflection. Her white hair was pinned back in a neat, severe bun. Her face, weathered by decades of wind and sun, was set in lines of quiet, unyielding focus. She slipped her arms into the silk sleeves of the coat. The heavy calfskin settled over her shoulders with a familiar, reassuring weight. She buttoned the silver crests one by one, from her waist to her throat. The high collar framed her jaw, highlighting the sharp, aristocratic lines she had inherited from the Montgomery line, the lines Victor had tried so hard to pretend were hers alone to lose. She reached down and took the gray plastic recorder. Took the gray plastic microcassette recorder from the cash box and slid it into the deep, silk-lined interior pocket of the coat. It fit perfectly against her ribs, a small, hard shape right over her heart. She looked at herself in the cracked glass. She was no longer the evicted sister hiding in the dirt. She was the true matriarch of Oak Ridge, and she was going to collect her debt. Wealth, when it is stolen, requires a great deal of glass to look clean. The Grand Pavilion at Oak Ridge was an architectural monument to the family's vanity. Built in the late 1990s under Victor's personal direction, it was a massive octagonal structure of glass and polished brass. Tonight, under the black Illinois sky, the pavilion glowed like a cut diamond, its warm golden light reflecting. Tonight, under the black Illinois sky, the pavilion glowed like a cut diamond, its warm golden light reflecting off the parked luxury sedans and sports cars that lined the drive. Inside, the air was warm, smelling of expensive French perfume, melting wax, and the hundreds of white lilies that spilled from crystal vases. A jazz trio played softly in the corner, the bass notes vibrating. The Chicago elite, real estate moguls, equestrian judges, and local politicians chatted in small, exclusive circles, the clink of their champagne flutes a polite, rhythmic static. Victor Montgomery stood at the mahogany podium at the center of the room, directly beneath the massive glass dome. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, his white silk shirt contrasting sharply with his deep artificial tan. He gripped the edges of the podium with both hands, his gold signet ring catching the light of the chandeliers above. "We stand on the precipice of a new millennium," Victor's voice boomed through the high-end PA system, smooth and perfectly paced. "And with this new era comes a historic transition. Tonight, we celebrate the merger of Oak Ridge with the European Equestrian Group." Tonight, we celebrate the merger of Oak Ridge with the European Equestrian Group, a partnership that secures our family's legacy for the next 50 years. The crowd erupted in polite, structured applause. Victor smiled, nodding to a group of investors in the front row. Among them sat Judge Vance, raising his glass in a silent, conspiratorial toast. "But a legacy is nothing without the next generation." "But a legacy is nothing without the next generation," Victor continued, his voice taking on a warm, parental tone. He turned his head, gesturing to the young woman standing to his left. "My niece, Ashley Montgomery. Next month, she departs for West Palm Beach to begin her training for the Olympic selection trials. She carries the Oak Ridge name, and she carries the future of American show jumping." Ashley stepped forward into the spotlight. She wore a cream-colored silk evening gown that flowed around her feet like water. She smiled, her teeth white and perfect, but her fingers clutched the stem of her champagne glass with enough force to threaten the crystal. She looked at the crowd, at the smiling, wealthy faces, but her chest felt hollow. Her mind kept drifting to the cold gravel driveway. Her mind kept drifting to the cold gravel driveway of the morning before, to the sight of her mother, standing alone in a faded coat while the donation truck drove away. "Thank you," Ashley murmured into the microphone, her voice trembling slightly. The crowd clapped louder, a warm wave of approval that should have felt like victory, but felt instead like a weight. "We have always kept the name pure." "We have always kept the Montgomery name pure," Victor's voice took over again, his hand settling on Ashley's shoulder, his grip firm, guiding. "My father Charles believed in honor. He believed in doing things the right way, without shortcuts. And tonight we honor his memory by taking Oak Ridge to the global stage." Outside, on the dark, manicured lawn, a pair of boots clicked against the stone. Outside, on the dark, manicured lawn, a pair of boots clicked against the stone tiles of the terrace. The sound was slow, heavy, and deliberate. It did not match the light, hurried steps of the catering staff or the guests arriving late. It was a rhythmic, solid strike that grew louder as it neared the heavy glass double doors of the pavilion. Grace Montgomery walked out of the darkness. She did not use the side entrance. She walked straight to the main glass doors, her mother's chocolate-brown leather coat swinging around her shins. The silver-embossed buttons on the front caught the golden light of the chandeliers, flashing like warning beacons through the glass. She pushed the doors open. A sudden cold draft of October air rushed into the warm pavilion, carrying the scent. A sudden cold draft of October air rushed into the warm pavilion, carrying the scent of dry leaves and damp Illinois clay. The silk drapes near the entrance fluttered, and the clink of champagne glasses in the back row died a sudden, quiet death. Grace stepped onto the polished marble floor. The sound of marble under leather is a cold kind of music. Grace walked down the center of the pavilion. Grace walked down the center of the octagonal pavilion, her boots striking the polished stone with a slow, heavy rhythm. The guests parted before her, some stepping backward into the white lily arrangements, others lowering their champagne flutes as they took in the sight of her. Whispers, sharp and low, rippled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. "Is that Grace Montgomery?" On the stage, Victor's face transitioned from a deep, artificial tan to the color of wet cement. His hand, still resting on the mahogany podium, began to slide, his fingers leaving a smear of sweat on the polished wood. He looked at Judge Vance, then at the two private security guards standing by the kitchen entrance. "Bob," Victor's voice came through the microphone, "escort her out. Escort her out. She is trespassing. This is a private estate function." The guards, thick-necked men in black blazers, started toward Grace. Grace did not look at them. She did not look at Victor or at Ashley, whose champagne glass finally slipped from her hand, shattering on the marble floor in a bright, wet star of foam and crystal. Grace turned to the left, walking toward the booth. Grace turned to the left, walking straight toward the sound technician's booth near the jazz trio's stage. The audio technician, a young man in a rental tuxedo, stood frozen behind a massive digital mixing console. Grace stopped in front of him. The two security guards were 10 feet away, their heavy shoes squeaking on the stone. Grace reached into her deep pocket and pulled out the recorder. Grace reached into the deep, silk-lined pocket of her leather coat and pulled out the gray plastic microcassette recorder. She did not argue. She simply picked up the thick black auxiliary cable connected to the main house CD player, the one providing the background music, and plugged it directly into the headphone jack of her Sony recorder. "Don't touch that console," Grace said to the technician. "Don't touch that console," Grace said to the technician. She did not raise her voice, but the cold, absolute authority of her tone made the young man step backward, his hands lifting in surrender. "Stop her!" Victor shouted from the stage, his voice losing its smooth, corporate cadence, cracking into a desperate, high-pitched register. "She's unstable! Shut the power down!" The security guards reached for Grace's shoulders. Grace did not flinch. She leaned forward and slammed her thumb down on the heavy plastic play button of the recorder. A loud mechanical clack echoed through the pavilion's high-end Bose speakers. For 2 seconds, there was only a deep, rushing hiss of magnetic tape static, so loud that the murmurs of the crowd died instantly. Every eye fixed. Every eye in the room fixed on the black speakers hanging from the glass dome. Then, Miriam Montgomery's voice filled the grand pavilion. "Julian, stop pacing. Sit down." The crowd went entirely still. Several older socialites, women who had dined with Miriam in the 1970s, gasped, their hands flying to their throats. On stage, Victor froze, his arms hanging limp at his sides. On stage, Victor froze, his arms hanging limp at his sides, his chest flat as if the air had been violently sucked from his lungs. "I can't, Mother. The police, they were at the country club today. They were asking about the bearer bonds. If Father finds out—" The voice through the speakers was Victor's, but it was 18 years old, thin, weeping, and thick with terror. "He found the key in Grace's room," the recording continued, the static rising and falling like a tide. "I put it there. I put the bonds under her mattress, Mother. I had to. The men from Chicago, they said they'd burn the barns with the horses inside if I didn't pay. They knew Father had the cash for the stallion." The silence in the pavilion was suffocating, so absolute. The silence in the pavilion was suffocating, so absolute that the low hum of the refrigeration units in the catering kitchen could be heard in the back row. Grace stood by the mixing board, her hand resting on the metal frame of the console, her chin lifted. She looked directly at her brother, her eyes dark, cold, and entirely unreadable. "You let your sister take the blame, Victor," Miriam's voice said. "You let your sister take the blame, Victor." Miriam's voice rumbled through the crystal chandeliers, heavy with a 20-year-old grief. "Your father threw her in the mud. He ruined her name." "Grace is strong!" Victor's recorded voice rose in a desperate, cracking shriek. "She can handle him, Mother. If Father finds out it was me, he'll write me out of the estate. He'll put me in the street. He'll put me in the street. I swear to God, Mother, if you tell him, I'll hang myself from the rafters of the North Stable." Ashley stared at her uncle, her lips parted, her face entirely white. She took a step away from him, her silk gown rustling in the dead silence of the room. Some men are built of stone. Others are merely built of the secrets they keep. When the secret is dragged into the light, the man hollows out before your eyes. Through the high-end speakers of the Grand Pavilion, the 18-year-old Victor's voice delivered the final crushing blow. Grace had nothing to do with it. The magnetic tape reached its end. The microcassette recorder let out a sharp, mechanical clack, and the speakers returned to a low, quiet hum of empty static. No one moved. In the front row, the two representatives of the European Equestrian Group, Men who had flown from Munich to finalize a multi-million-dollar land acquisition stood up in unison. They did not look at Victor. They quietly closed their leather portfolios, zipped them shut, and buttoned their tailored charcoal coats. One of them turned to Judge Vance, who was already sliding toward the exit. Toward the terrace exit, his face averted. "The transaction is terminated," the German representative said, his English precise, sharp, and loud enough to carry to the center of the room. "We do not invest in properties with fraudulent titles, or families with this kind of history." Victor tried to speak. He opened his mouth. His tongue dry, his throat clicking as he swallowed. He reached for the microphone on the podium, but his hand shook so violently he knocked the metal stand. It fell against the mahogany wood with a loud, hollow thud that echoed through the glass dome. Grace walked toward the stage. Her chocolate-brown leather duster brushed against the white lilies. As she passed them, the heavy calfskin rustling in the dead quiet of the pavilion. She climbed the 3 wooden steps of the stage. Her boots were worn, scuffed with dry mud, but her stride was slow, steady, and filled with the absolute gravity of a woman who had already won. She stopped 3 feet from her brother. Victor looked up at her. The confidence that had defined him for 20 years, the slick, polished ease of a wealthy Chicago developer, had melted away, leaving his face looking old, flaccid, and gray. "Grace," Victor whispered. He reached out a hand, his fingers twitching, but he did not dare touch the leather sleeve of their mother's coat. "Grace, we can talk about this, in the study, private. We are family, Grace. We can divide the shares differently. I can give you the deed to the cottage, the deed to the whole estate." Grace looked down at him. Her eyes were as dark and calm as deep water. "I did not steal the $80,000, Victor," Grace said. "I did not ruin this family. You did. You stole the money. You forged the evidence. And then you stood on the porch. And watched our father throw me into the mud while you saved your own skin." "I was a boy," Victor gasped, his chest heaving as he struggled for air. "I was terrified. Father would have killed me, Grace. You know how he was. You know what he would have done to me." "You were 18, Grace said, "and you let me carry your shame for 20 years. You let my daughter grow up believing her mother was a thief. You let me clean the stalls of the horses you bought with stolen money." Victor's knees gave way. He did not slide. He dropped. His knees hit the polished wood of the mahogany stage with a hollow, physical thud that made the microphone on the floor hum. He reached out, his manicured hands grabbing the hem of Miriam's leather coat. His forehead pressing against the dark brown calfskin. "Don't go to the sheriff, Grace," Victor sobbed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, wet rattle. "Please, the statute of limitations. They'll reopen the probate. They'll take everything. I'll go to prison, Grace. I can't survive. Please, for Mother's sake." Grace did not pull the coat away. She stood entirely still, letting him kneel at her feet in front of the entire Chicago Assembly. "Mother is dead, Victor," Grace said, her voice dropping to a cold, quiet whisper. "She died protecting your weakness. and you used her silence to throw me onto the street yesterday morning." She looked past his trembling shoulders to where Ashley stood. Her daughter was staring at her, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face, leaving dark tracks through her makeup. She looked at her mother in the vintage leather coat, then at her uncle groveling in the dust of the stage. "Mom," Ashley whispered, "Mom, I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know." Grace looked at her daughter, her expression unchanged. There was no joy in her victory, only the cold, clean weight of the truth. "I know you didn't, Ashley," Grace said, "but you chose to believe the lie because it was comfortable." She turned back to Victor. She reached down, pried his fingers off the hem of her coat, and stepped backward. "The sheriff will have the tape by 9 tomorrow morning." "The sheriff will have the tape by 9 tomorrow morning, Victor," Grace said. "I suggest you call your lawyers tonight." She turned and walked off the stage, her mother's leather coat flowing behind her like a banner of absolute, uncontested victory. Forgiveness is a quiet thing, but trust must be built with sweat. The morning sun of late October did not warm the Old North stable. It merely frosted. The morning sun of late October did not warm the Old North stable. It merely highlighted the frost on the window panes and the gray fog rising from the damp clay soil of the paddocks. Grace sat at her wooden workbench in the harness room. A mug of black coffee, heated over her small camping stove, sent a thin coil of steam into the cold air. Beside her lay a rolled-up copy of the Chicago Tribune. She had walked to the mailbox to collect at dawn. The headline on the local section was small but sharp. "Prominent developer faces investigation in estate fraud." Below it, a grainy photo of Victor leaving the county courthouse in the back of a police cruiser. The European Consortium had formally pulled out of the Oak Ridge deal at midnight. Victor's bank had frozen his commercial credit lines by 8 a.m., and 3 of his largest investors had already filed civil injunctions to prevent him from moving assets out of state. The empire, built on 20 years of silence, had taken less than 12 hours to disintegrate. The heavy sliding door of the barn groaned. On its track. Grace did not stand. She picked up her leather working knife, a flat crescent-shaped blade, and began to scrape the edge of a stirrup leather she was repairing. Ashley walked into the harness room. She wore an oversized gray wool sweater and faded jeans, no makeup, her hair pulled back into a messy, hurried knot. Her eyes were swollen, red-rimmed from a night of crying, and her hands were tucked into her sleeves to keep them from shaking. She looked 22, but she also looked like a child who had suddenly realized the adults in her world were monsters. She stopped by the rusted potbelly stove, her boots leaving wet, dark prints on the gray floorboards. Grace did not look up from her leather. She pressed the blade against the tough hide, a thin curl of dark brown leather peeling away under her thumb. "They're going to seize the manor, Mom," Ashley whispered. She took a step closer, her chest heaving as a fresh wave of tears spilled over her cheeks. "The Florida training program, my spot on the selection team. They canceled it at 7. The sponsor called at 7. They don't want the Montgomery name associated with their brand anymore. I have nothing left." Grace set the knife down. The metal clinked against the pine workbench, a clean, heavy sound. She looked at her daughter. "You have your health, Ashley," Grace said, "and you have your youth. Do not tell me you have nothing." Ashley let out a ragged, hopeful breath. Dropping to her knees on the floorboards, her hands reaching out to clutch at Grace's knees. "I'm sorry," Ashley sobbed, her forehead pressing against Grace's lap. "I was so stupid. I wanted the Florida spot so badly. I wanted to believe Uncle Victor because he had the money, and he made everything so easy. I should have known. I should have looked at you and known." "You wanted the comfortable lie," Grace said, "because the comfortable lie allowed you to buy custom riding boots and ride $50,000 horses while your mother lived in the servants' quarters. You didn't ask questions because you didn't want to hear the answers." "I'll stay here with you," Ashley pleaded, her forehead pressing against Grace's lap. "I'll stay here with you," Ashley pleaded. "We can clean this barn. I'll help you with the leather working. We can fix the cottage. I'll do whatever you want, Mom. Just, please, don't look at me like I'm a stranger." Grace reached down. She placed her calloused, oil-stained hands on Ashley's shoulders and gently, firmly pushed her upward until the girl was forced to stand and look her in the eyes. "You cannot live in a barn, Ashley," Grace said, "and you cannot make 20 years of silence right in one morning. I am your mother. I will always love you. That is a fact of biology, and nothing Victor did could change that. I forgive you." Ashley let out a ragged, hopeful breath, but Grace's grip on her shoulders did not soften. "But I do not trust you," Grace said, her words cold and clear. "But I do not trust you," Grace said, her words cold, clear, and perfectly steady. "Trust is not a gift, Ashley. It is a structure. You built yours with Victor's money, and it fell down. Now you must build yours with me, from the dirt, from zero." "How?" Ashley whispered. "You will pack your bags," Grace said. "You will go to Chicago. You will find a job that has nothing to do with horses. You will find a job that has nothing to do with horses, and an apartment you pay for with your own sweat. You will live a life where no one carries your name for you. And when you have done that for a year, you may come to my table, and we will talk about being mother and daughter." Ashley stared at her, her lips parting as she realized there would be no easy hug, no warm reconciliation. Ashley stared at her, her lips parting as she realized there would be no easy hug, no warm reconciliation to erase the shame of her betrayal. She saw only her mother's unyielding, leather-hard resolve. Slowly, Ashley nodded. She wiped her face with her sleeve, her shoulders straightening slightly. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, Mom." She turned and walked out of the harness room, her steps slower. Her steps slower now, but solid. Grace watched her go. She picked up her crescent blade, held the stirrup leather against the light, and went back to work. A house is only as strong as its foundation, and a life is only as free as the truth it is built upon. Grace Montgomery did not keep Oak Ridge. She did not want the towering columns of the manor house. The sterile glass dome of the pavilion, or the land that had been bought with 20 years of her silence. The memories there were too heavily poisoned, the soil still clinging to the dark legacy of her father's rage and her mother's compromise. With the help of a pro bono attorney, Grace filed a civil suit for estate fraud. Grace filed a civil suit for estate fraud and the wrongful termination of her partnership. Backed by the undeniable evidence of the microcassette and the original 1980 ledger, Victor's legal team collapsed within 6 weeks. The court ordered the immediate dissolution of the Montgomery Family Trust. Oak Ridge was sold to a reputable European equestrian consortium, men who respected the true history. Oak Ridge was sold to a reputable European equestrian consortium, men who respected the true history of horse breeding and had no interest in suburban Chicago politics. Victor was evicted from the manor, his assets liquidated to pay off his massive commercial debts and the legal settlements. He left the property in a rented sedan, bankrupt, stripped of his status, and facing a 5-year suspended sentence. He left the property in a rented sedan, bankrupt, stripped of his status, and facing a 5-year suspended sentence for probate fraud that ensured he would spend his remaining years in obscurity. Grace used her share of the sale to move north. 1 year later, in the autumn of 2001, she stood in the doorway of a small cedar plank cabin on the shores of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. 1 year later, in the autumn of 2001, she stood in the doorway of a small cedar plank cabin on the shores of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. The air here was different. It didn't scrape. It smelled of white pine, fresh water, and the damp, clean earth of the northern woods. Behind the cabin, a bright, sun-drenched workshop looked out over the blue waters of the lake, the room filled with the rich. Behind the cabin, a bright, sun-drenched workshop looked out over the blue waters of the lake, the room filled with the rich, comforting scents of beeswax, cedar shavings, and high-grade saddle soap. On the far wall of her workshop, hanging in a custom glass-fronted cedar frame, was her mother's restored chocolate-brown leather riding duster. The silver buttons with the original Oak Ridge crest. The silver buttons with the original Oak Ridge crest gleamed in the afternoon sun. No longer a symbol of Miriam's shame, but a monument to the dignity Grace had reclaimed through her own hands. The sound of car tires on gravel broke the quiet murmur of the lake. Grace walked to the front porch, her hands resting on the wooden railing. A simple blue Ford sedan pulled up to the cabin. The driver's door opened, and Ashley stepped out. She looked different. The expensive country club styling was gone, replaced by a simple canvas jacket and work boots. Her blonde hair was loose, blowing in the lake breeze. For the past 12 months, she had lived in a tiny studio apartment in Chicago, working 60 hours a week as an assistant. Working 60 hours a week as an assistant at a veterinary clinic, paying her own rent and learning the true cost of a single dollar. She carried a small duffel bag over her shoulder. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, her eyes meeting Grace's. "I brought my own tools," Ashley said, her voice quiet. But steady and clear. Grace looked at her daughter. She saw the new, hard-won maturity in the lines of her face, the quiet pride in her posture that had not been bought with Victor's checkbook. Grace smiled, stepping aside to let her enter the cabin. "Come inside. The coffee is hot, and I have a 60-year-old McClellan saddle that needs." "Come inside. The coffee is hot, and I have a 60-year-old McClellan saddle that needs its seat lining replaced. I'll show you how to pull the wax thread." Ashley climbed the steps, her boots striking the wooden porch with a solid, honest sound, and walk through the door. Grace Montgomery's journey proves something powerful and universally true. The truth does not have an expiration date. The truth does not have an expiration date, and evidence preserved with love and pain can wait patiently for decades until the moment it is finally needed. If this story touched something deep in your heart, leave a comment below. Share this video on Silver Linings Tales. We refuse to let the past define us, and we know that patience and integrity will always triumph in the end. Welcome to our family.